Southern Fried True Crime covers cases that are not suitable for young listeners, and there may also be some explicit language used. Listener discretion is advised. When we call 911, we expect first responders to get there as soon as possible. The torment of waiting can make it seem like it takes forever for help to arrive, even if it's only a matter of minutes. But what if it's not your panic and fear? What if it takes a large metropolitan police force almost an hour to get to you? In a medical emergency, every second counts. And even if it's clear that there is no hope for the injured person, the despair of waiting that long next to their body is agony. Thursday, October 13th, 1994, was a big day for New Orleans. On one side of town, their new police superintendent, Richard Pennington, was being sworn into office. On the other side of town, a beloved mother of 3 was being murdered. This mother was 32-year-old Kim Marie Groves. As a result of Kim's death at the hands of dirty police officers, the New Orleans Police Department's rampant corruption would be exposed, and Superintendent Pennington's reign as the head of the NOPD would be forever changed. Welcome to episode 193, Police Corruption and the Murder of Kim Groves. On that Thursday, October 13th of 1994, 48-year-old Richard Pennington was sworn in as the city of New Orleans' newest police chief. It was an exciting ceremony, one of pomp and circumstance. The air probably smelled fresh, like new beginnings. And why shouldn't it? He was a great candidate for police superintendent. He was certainly qualified for the role. At age 18, Richard had enlisted in the U.S. Air Force and served in the Vietnam War. After that, he became a law enforcement officer with the Metropolitan Police Department in Washington, D.C. He stayed there for 26 years and was even promoted to assistant chief. Now Richard was in the big leagues. This was his first stint at the top of the food chain, the superintendent of the New Orleans Police Department, and he was ready. Or at least he thought he was. Minutes after he became superintendent, an FBI agent pulled him aside. This agent explained to the newly appointed police chief that the corruption within the New Orleans Police Department was bad. Very bad. Far worse than anybody could have ever imagined. As time went on, the FBI agents explained to Richard the nuances of the NOPD's corruption. There were rogue officers, a drug ring, and an elaborate FBI sting operation meant to take down dozens of dirty cops. Years later, Richard told the Times-Picayune newspaper, "I thought, my Lord, what am I getting myself into?" And it just so happens, in an act of pure coincidence, on October 13th, 1994, the same day that Richard Pennington was shaking hands and being congratulated for his new position as the superintendent of the NOPD, a woman was being murdered. Her name was Kim Groves. And her death would become the unexpected catalyst that revealed what the FBI had suspected all along: years and years of corruption within the New Orleans Police Department. Kim Marie Groves was born on January 10, 1962, in New Orleans, to parents Nathaniel and Gwendolyn. We don't know much about Kim's childhood, but through Kim's family, we do know that she became an important woman who impacted the lives of many. In an interview with Rare Reports, Kim's nephew, Pops, and her youngest daughter, Jasmine, described Kim as, above all else, a mother. She was a literal mother to her 3 children, Jasmine, her son, and her eldest daughter. But Kim wasn't just a biological mother. She was a spiritual one, a protector by nature, a warrior, a queen. In Kim's neighborhood, the 5th District in New Orleans, she was recognized as a mother to all. As in, if you were a kid in the 1300 block of Alabo Street, you knew Kim was family. You knew she cared about you, loved you, wanted what was best for you, and she would fight tooth and nail to make sure you were safe, happy, and healthy. Kim watched over everyone. She wasn't going to let anyone slip through the cracks, and she regularly went above and beyond to ensure the well-being of others. She was known for celebrating the successes of the neighborhood kids. Get an A on a test? Kim was ready to sing your praises. Get hired for a part-time job? She was going to be the first to congratulate you. But she was also known for reminding those same neighborhood kids to be better people when they made poor choices. And that's because Kim was a believer of justice. If you did something wrong, you needed to take responsibility for your actions. You had to. We all did. Otherwise, what would the world come to? So in the fall of 1994, when Kim heard that a high school acquaintance turned police officer and his partner had pistol whipped a neighborhood kid, she was not going to let it slide. Especially because the kid in question, a teenager named Nathan, hadn't done anything wrong. According to Kim, the officers had mistaken Nathan for a person involved in the shooting of an officer. About a day after this pistol whipping incident happened, on or near October 11th, Kim went to the New Orleans Police Department Office of Internal Affairs. There, she filed a complaint against that officer who she knew from high school and his partner. In the complaint, Kim reported both officers for alleged police brutality. On the evening of Thursday, October 13th, Kim was at home planning a party. Her youngest daughter, Jasmine's 13th birthday was the next day on Friday, October 14th. Everyone was excited. 13 years old is such a big deal. Little Jasmine wasn't so little anymore. She would be a teenager, just one step closer to adulthood. That Thursday night, Jasmine had her cousin over for a sleepover. They were playing card games when Kim burst into the room, serenading Jasmine with her own silly rendition of the happy birthday song. And it was such a happy moment, one that, according to Jasmine, she would never forget. Not long after this mini birthday celebration, Kim stepped out of the house. It was about 11 p.m. We're not sure where she was going, and honestly, it doesn't matter, because minutes later, the phone started ringing in the Groves household. After a few rings, Jasmine picked up the phone. The person on the other end of the line, a woman, was screaming. Frantically, she told Jasmine, "Kim has just been shot, and I think she's dead." Jasmine ran out of the house down the block and around the corner, and that's when she saw her mother, 32-year-old Kim Marie Groves, lying on the cement. She was dead, and the cause was clear. A single gunshot wound delivered straight to Kim's head in what reporters would later call execution style. As 12-year-old Jasmine took the scene in, she was immediately in shock. But soon she realized somebody needed to call 911, and that somebody was her. But according to Jasmine, after she explained the tragic situation to a 911 operator, it still took emergency responders 45 minutes to arrive. And even though Jasmine recalled that her mother was clearly dead, far beyond the help of any medical professional, that long of a response time was still upsetting. It was yet another clue that the New Orleans Police Department was not concerned about Kim or Jasmine or anyone else in the New Orleans 5th District. As Jasmine and her family waited for the police, they sat alongside Kim's lifeless body. Jasmine told Rare Reports that her grandfather picked up Kim's spilled brain matter and washed it in a nearby levee. Jasmine explained that this was a ritual, a cleansing that would allow Kim to be fully released from this world and sent peacefully onward to the next. After the police came and went, they left remnants of Kim's murder on the sidewalk for over 24 hours. Jasmine remembered seeing her mother's bloodstains on the sidewalk after school the next day. And later, Jasmine would say, it felt like a dream. Almost a month passed after Kim's murder, and it appeared that there was little to no progress on her investigation. An eyewitness had said the killer looked similar to Kim's boyfriend. But when it turned out the perpetrator wasn't Kim's boyfriend, that was it. The investigation slowed to a full, heart-wrenching stop. For all intents and purposes, it seemed like the New Orleans authorities could care less about Kim. And since Kim's murder didn't make the news, there wasn't any public pressure to force the NOPD to care either. But suddenly, on November 2nd of 1994, the FBI came out of the woodwork. They received 8 search warrants. one of which was for the home of 24-year-old Damon Causey, a known drug trafficker with a reputation for violence. During the raid, the FBI found a gun in Damon's home. They knew they would. After all, the FBI had raided Damon's home specifically to look for this specific gun. And then ballistics testing proved what the FBI had already suspected, that Damon's 9mm handgun was the murder weapon used in Kim Groves' death. It matched a bullet casing found at the scene of the crime and everything. But how had the FBI known to look for the murder weapon used to kill Kim in Damon's home? In fact, why were the FBI involved in Kim's case at all? Kim, a beloved woman, had been betrayed by her local police and her local media, both of whom hadn't taken hardly any notice of her absence. So why had the FBI, the United States' top investigative force, take notice? Well, it's a hell of a story. To explain it, I'll have to go back to the beginning. In 1988, a 24-year-old man named Len Davis joined the New Orleans Police Department. And right from the beginning, Len was not the perfect cop. In fact, he was far from perfect. Over the course of 7 years at the NOPD, Len would gain a reputation for poor performance. In 1990, he was suspended for 15 days after crashing his police vehicle. And on another occasion, he was found guilty of a battery arrest and was suspended for 51 days. And Len didn't handle his ever-growing list of disciplinary infractions well. He started drinking more. He became increasingly violent while on duty. And the number of internal affairs complaints filed against Len's behavior went up and up. Later, one of his own lawyers would indicate that Len never had any business being on a police force. So why was Len still on the New Orleans police force? Why didn't they just fire him? You know the old saying, how one bad apple spoils the bunch. Well, if ever there had been a bad apple, it was probably Len Davis. If the NOPD could just throw Len out, they would save the rest of them from being equally rotten. But the department couldn't fire Len. They couldn't fire anybody. And that's because the NOPD was drowning in violence. In the mid-90s, New Orleans experienced more criminal activity than ever before. And the year Kim Groves was murdered, 1994, there had been a record-breaking amount of homicide victims, 424 to be exact. A former commander of the NOPD's homicide division, Jimmy Keene, told the Times-Picayune, "We were really knee-deep in murders. We just chased our tails going from one murder to the next." New Orleans was overwhelmed by crime and underwhelmed by qualified applicants for police officer positions. And since the NOPD was forced to accept anybody and everybody into their ranks, they became horribly corrupt. New Orleans police officers knew their jobs were secure. And with an annual salary of less than $18,000 a year, which is $37,000 in today's money, these officers were looking for side gigs. And some of them didn't much care whether or not these side gigs were legal. Now, $37,000 may sound like an okay salary, depending on where you live, but New Orleans has always been known for its staggeringly high cost of living. Today, New Orleans is 44% more expensive to live than the average U.S. city. Because of all these contributing factors, the NOPD became notorious for accepting cash in exchange for favors, committing crimes and hurting civilians, all without facing any consequences. At first, the people of New Orleans were outraged by this illegal police activity. They filed complaint after complaint against the NOPD. The Justice Department reported that in the 90s, New Orleans sometimes led the country in police brutality complaints. But after a while, when nothing seemed to be changing, the people of New Orleans stopped speaking out against the police as often. Why would you? If nothing was going to change, and now you would have a target on your back, it simply wasn't worth it. The mayor of New Orleans, Mark Morial, who was elected the same year Kim was killed, said, "The New Orleans Police Department was the worst police department in the nation, riddled with corruption, leading the nation in civil rights complaints and populated by criminals in uniforms. It was a tremendous stain on the police department's history." Needless to say, the department didn't have any credibility within its community, especially not in its more affordable neighborhoods like the 5th District, where most of the crime was happening. In 1994, the 5th District was where 1/3 of all New Orleans homicides happened. For the record, there are 8 districts recognized by the NOPD, so one of them being home to 1/3 of all murders, that's a big deal, a statistical anomaly. This is the location where you want your best and brightest officers, the cream of the crop. But of course, the NOPD wasn't equipped to assign the best and brightest anywhere. So in 1989, the 5th District is where the young officer Len Davis made a name for himself. Locals called Len the Desire Terrorist, and that's because he frequently patrolled a public housing complex called Desire. And as his nickname suggests, Len wasn't above using terror to get his way. Before Len ever became a police officer, he and Kim Groves actually knew each other. They had attended the same New Orleans high school sometime in the 80s. Len was a few years behind Kim, but Kim had interacted with him on several occasions. Enough times to know that she was not a fan. From the way Kim's daughter Jasmine tells it, not many were a fan of Len Davis, even as a teenager. According to Jasmine, Kim thought he was weak, maybe even mean. And Len wasn't above picking on other kids. According to Jasmine, Kim once saw Len try to convince some other probably younger boys to put their heads under the tires of parked vehicles. And Kim, always a protector, always a mother, immediately put a stop to that bullshit. She told Len exactly what he should be doing instead of harassing other kids. Jasmine speculated in her interview with Rare Reports that perhaps Len liked being a cop because of his friendless childhood experiences. For so long, he was probably the butt of a lot of jokes, maybe even bullied before he became a bully himself. Now, as a police officer, Len had power. If someone acted in a way he didn't like, he could arrest them, or worse. Over time, Len Davis became one of the more corrupt NOPD officers. His big thing was protecting drug dealers and traffickers in exchange for money. Through this operation, Len made friends with many seedy people in the dark underbelly of New Orleans, including a narcotics dealer and hitman named Paul Hardy. His friends called him Cool. When Len's colleague, Officer Leon Duncan, realized he was getting closer to this guy, he was concerned. And it wasn't even like Leon was a squeaky clean officer. He just knew that Paul was a really, really bad guy. In fact, according to Leon, Paul was the suspect in quite a few murder cases he had worked on. So when Leon saw Len take a call from Paul during a backyard cookout, he asked Len what was going on. Here's what Leon testified in court. Len Davis got on the phone and he told the individual on the phone, Yeah, I'm home. Just come on over. When I asked him who that was, thinking it was a policeman that he was inviting over since he was having a cookout. And Len said, Oh, that's Paul. I said, Paul Hardy? And he said, Yeah. And I said, What the fuck are you doing hanging out with a cold-blooded killer like Paul Hardy? And he said, Man, Paul Hardy ain't never killed nobody that didn't deserve to die. I said, Who the fuck are you or Paul Hardy to decide who lives or dies? And he made the statement, Well, Dunk, you just don't understand the game. I said, Fuck the game. We're talking about people's lives. And he said, See, that's your problem now. In addition to all this, Len also helped a group of law enforcement officers sell cocaine on the streets of New Orleans. Together, these police officers covered each other's tracks through violence, intimidation, and falsified evidence. All this is to say, if NOPD police officers in the 90s were bad, Len Davis might have been the worst. But the universe had something waiting for Len, an act of karma that was going to help balance the scales of justice. Because one day, Len tried to pressure a cocaine dealer into paying him for his protection services. And that cocaine dealer just so happened to be an FBI informant. And when the FBI learned of Len's drug racket, they knew that he was only the tip of the iceberg. So the FBI orchestrated a complex sting operation to take down every corrupt officer in the New Orleans Police Department. It was called Operation Shattered Shield, and it began in December of 1993. The FBI knew that Len Davis and his partner, Sammy Williams, were eager to make money through illegal drugs. So undercover FBI agents posed as a large-scale cocaine operation, and they hired Len and Sammy to assist their business. Len and Sammy helped safeguard drug shipments and stood watch at a warehouse filled to the brim with cocaine. After only a few months, Len and Sammy recruited 7 other police officers to join them. The undercover FBI agents running the whole thing were stunned at how smoothly this entire process was going. They had enough evidence to charge Len pretty early on, but as long as Len kept bringing in more and more corrupt cops, the FBI was happy to let the operation continue. And these police officers were bold too. Sometimes they would engage in illegal activity while on duty and in uniform. In no time at all, the FBI had plenty of recorded evidence they could use to put these officers away. But of course, Operation Shattered Shield had some bumps. According to the then New Orleans FBI commander Neil Gallagher, one undercover FBI agent was almost outed in the early stages. Somehow, a rumor got around that one guy was an undercover FBI agent. A showdown occurred, and this FBI agent had to strip naked to show everyone he wasn't wearing a wire. And luckily, that agent just happened to not being a wire at that specific time. And even more luckily, the entire ordeal was captured on videotape. But as far as extremely dangerous FBI missions go, this one was fairly smooth, and the FBI had a lot riding on it. A year into the sting, the FBI had employed the efforts of over 60 agents. They used more than 130 kilos of real cocaine. And they paid about $97,000 in cash to Len and his guys. The FBI needed their investments here to pay out, and they suspected that, besides the 9 NOPD officers they already caught red-handed, they could probably get 2 more with just a little time. In case you're counting, that's about 30 corrupt New Orleans police officers. At this time, the entire NOPD had about 200 officers. So that means 15% of the New Orleans Police Department could have gone down for corruption. But unfortunately, they didn't. And that's because the FBI ran out of the one thing they needed: time. Now let's return to October of 1994. Kim Groves bravely made a complaint against both Len and his partner Sammy for police brutality, and this complaint should have been confidential. But at around 1 a.m. on October 12th, Len found out about it. One of his fellow officers called him and explained the situation in detail. Kim Groves, an acquaintance Len already didn't like, had had some bad things to say about Len's policing. And Len was outraged. He insisted Kim was lying, that his partner Sammy had pistol whipped the kid, not him. For the record, even if that's true, who cares? You can't just watch your police partner beat up a kid and not do anything. Right after learning of Kim's complaint against him, Len paged his good buddy, 27-year-old Paul Hardy, and Paul called back. The 2 men discussed, in vague terminology, their plan to kill Kim Groves. Paul was to shoot her. Then Len and his partner Sammy would falsify evidence at the crime scene to cover Paul's tracks. Len and Sammy drove Paul to Kim's neighborhood in their police car. The 3 men tried to track her down, but couldn't find her. At about 7:30 p.m., Paul got out of the car to walk around the neighborhood, but Kim was nowhere to be found. Len was frustrated. He wanted to take care of Kim now. Len and Sammy drove Paul home. They were to call Paul once they found Kim. Len and Sammy went back to the 5th District where Kim lived and continued searching. Len became angrier and angrier as the evening went on and Kim remained alive. At about 10 p.m., Len and Sammy found her. She was near her home on the 1300 block of Alabo Street. Len paged Paul and Paul called back. Then Len described Kim's appearance to Paul. And Paul said that he was on his way. At this time, Sammy's shift had ended, so he went home, leaving Len to stew in his own negativity. 45 minutes later, Len was upset because Paul hadn't shown up. So Len called Paul again and described Kim again in excruciating detail, down to her light brown eyes. And after this call, Paul finally arrived, but he wasn't alone. 2 men were with him. One was 24-year-old Damon Causey. Damon was in charge of getting rid of the murder weapon, and the second man was Steve Jackson. He was the getaway driver. At 11 p.m. on October 13th, Paul found Kim around the corner from her home and killed her with a single shot to the head. He fled the scene with Damon and Steve. Then he called Len. Paul laughed as he confirmed that Kim was dead, and Len audibly celebrated, cheering at the death of the highly beloved and irreplaceable Kim Marie Groves. And the FBI, Well, they heard all of this, every single word exchanged between Len and Paul leading up to and after Kim's murder. So I know your first question, and it's a good one. How did they know all of this? Well, Len's cell phone was wiretapped by the FBI. In fact, Len had actually gotten the cell phone from the FBI. He told his new cocaine business associates, the ones that were undercover FBI agents, that he needed a cell phone to help conduct their business. And the undercover FBI agents posing as cocaine traffickers were happy to give Len a new cell phone with a few modifications so they could record his every move. Now you probably have a second question. I know that Kim's family definitely did, and that was if the FBI was listening to all of Len's phone calls and heard him and Paul colluding to assassinate Kim, why didn't they stop it? According to the FBI, their agents didn't know what to make of Len's strange phone conversations with Paul near the time of Kim's murder. They attributed the misunderstanding to Len and Paul's vague, coded language about Kim. Keep in mind, Len and Paul weren't speaking this way because they thought Len's phone was bugged, because they had no idea about that. They were using coded language probably because they didn't want eavesdroppers to get any ideas. Or at least that's how the FBI spun this part of the story. In court, the contents of these phone call recordings would be revealed, and as it turns out, Len and Paul weren't speaking in hardly any code at all. Len can be heard telling an unknown person, "I can get P to come and do that whore now, and then we can handle the 30. In this context, 30 is police code for homicide, as in my partner Sammy and I will clean up the homicide crime scene. And Len also told Paul, "Come do that whore now, and later, after it's done, go straight uptown and call me." Many people have criticized the FBI for not stopping the murder of Kim Groves, and they may be right. It wouldn't be the first time the FBI has been accused of letting someone they deem unnecessary die in order to further their larger mission. But the FBI publicly maintained that they did not know Kim was going to be shot. Gallagher, the leader of Operation Shattered Shield, was reported by the Times-Picayune to have said, "Unfortunately, we were not provided with enough information to allow us to prevent it. The pertinent conversations were spread out over a 10-hour period and were intermingled with many other discussions concerning their protection activity at the warehouse. The conversations simply did not alert us to what would occur. They were cryptic and they did not take on significance until compared with other events." But once it became clear to the FBI that Len had masterminded the murder of Kim Groves, they still didn't act. It wasn't until Len started planning violence against even more people, still using his bugged cell phone, that the FBI decided to pull the plug on Operation Shattered Shield. So as I said before, in November, 1 month after Kim's murder, the FBI raided Damon Causey's home. There, they found the murder weapon used to kill Kim. And a month after that, on December 5th, Len Davis, Paul Hardy, and Damon Causey were arrested. All three were charged with 1. Conspiracy to injure, oppress, threaten, and intimidate Kim Groves, and another individual in the right to be free from use of unreasonable force. We're not sure who that other individual is. And 2. Violating Kim Groves' civil rights. And 3. Killing Kim Groves with the intent to prevent her from communicating information to a federal law enforcement officer relating to the commission of a federal offense. They faced life in prison with a possibility of a death sentence. 2 days later, on December 7th, Len and 8 additional officers in the NOPD were arrested. They faced charges of conspiracy to distribute cocaine and use of firearms while drug trafficking. Among those 8 were a sergeant and Len's own partner, Sammy Williams. All 9 officers faced life in prison. But it was public knowledge that even more New Orleans officers probably would have been arrested had the FBI been able to continue their investigation. In fact, 12 officers had been placed on desk duty while awaiting the results of the FBI operation. 3 of those officers walked free. Attorney Frank DeSalvo, a representative of the Police Association of New Orleans, said on Wednesday, December 7th, "I just left 3 happy officers who didn't get indicted. Maybe there wasn't enough evidence, or maybe they didn't do anything." While Kim Groves' murder hadn't made hardly any newspapers only a few months before, now it was the talk of the town. Actually, this entire debacle was a huge scandal for New Orleans. Headlines focused on NOPD's widespread corruption, on how Officer Len Davis hired a triggerman to kill an unsuspecting mother. on the FBI's somewhat successful sting operation, and of course on the remaining unknown police officers who were a single hair's breadth away from being arrested by the FBI. If community feelings toward the NOPD were bad before, now they were abysmal. New Orleans residents had no way of knowing if the police officer who was supposed to be helping them was only one lucky break away from being indicted for corruption. The Operation Shattered Shield scandal was so big, it shaped the New Orleans political landscape. The city mayor at the time, Mark Morial, said Len Davis was, quote, one of the worst examples of what the department had come to. Morial asserted that he would not tolerate cavalier cops by saying, "We're on a crusade. We're going to be in a holy war. We're going to clean this department up." And on the same exact day that Kim Groves was murdered, the New Orleans Police Department was swearing in their new leader, Superintendent Richard Pennington. And Pennington famously learned of Kim's death, Len's corruption, and the secret FBI sting operation only a few days into his new job. Pennington had come to the NOPD knowing corruption was an issue. That was part of the reason he got the job, but he probably never imagined just how far the weeds of corruption had grown in the NOPD. There's even some suggestion that the previous superintendent was in on it. After all, the FBI hadn't told him about Operation Shattered Shield. As prosecutors Constantine Georges and Mike McMahon prepared for the trial against Len Davis, Paul Hardy, and Damon Causey, they decided to seek the death penalty for Len and Paul, not Damon. And on April 8th of 1996, 2 years after Kim's murder, the trial began. Len, Paul, and Damon were co-defendants. Steve Jackson, the getaway driver, testified for the prosecution. So if he faced any charges, which he might not have, it wasn't during this specific trial. Throughout the course of the trial, the state painted Len as the mastermind behind Kim's murder. He wanted Kim dead because she had filed a complaint against him with the NOPD's Internal Affairs Office. And this argument didn't take much convincing because Len was the mastermind. The many, many hours of recorded phone calls proved it. Honestly, the phone calls kind of made this case open and shut. There really was no question as to who had done what or why. But the state still covered all their bases. Len's partner, Sammy Williams, testified for the prosecution. Sammy pled guilty to those conspiracy and drug trafficking charges and was cooperating to get a lighter sentence. So in his testimony, Sammy corroborated the phone calls recorded by the FBI. And Sammy also explained that Len gave Paul $300 as a token of appreciation for the murder of Kim Groves. During closing arguments, Prosecutor McMahon said, "Life in prison is too good for Len Davis. He deserves to die for what he did." And Prosecutor Georges agreed, calling attention to the fact that Len had never expressed any remorse for his crimes. Georges asked the jury, "What more does someone have to do to deserve the highest penalty the law provides?" The only defense presented was that Kim's boyfriend was the killer. Because of the 2 eyewitnesses who said the assailant who shot Kim looked similar to Kim's boyfriend. Len did not testify. On Wednesday, April 24th, 1996, after 2 days of deliberations, the jury found 31-year-old Len Davis and 28-year-old Paul Hardy were guilty of all 3 charges. 25-year-old Damon Causey was found guilty of 2. The jury couldn't decide if Damon was guilty of actually killing Kim, which was the 3rd charge, so that ended in a mistrial. Upon hearing his guilty verdict, Len visibly sagged in his chair. He was sentenced to death. Next was Paul. He also received the death penalty, but after years of legal footwork, he was determined to be intellectually disabled, meaning he wasn't eligible for the death penalty. But many people, including some of Kim's family and experts on IQ testing, believed that Paul was not intellectually disabled. Rather, he had faked poor test scores to get out of the death penalty. Regardless, Paul won that legal fight, and although he's not facing the lethal injection, he will spend the rest of his life in prison. Damon was sentenced to life in prison. At this sentencing, his family became extraordinarily upset. Apparently, Damon had rejected a deal from the federal government just hours before his guilty verdict was announced. In that deal, Damon would have pled guilty to accessory to murder, and he only would have served a maximum of 9 years in prison. But according to Damon's lawyer, Damon had rejected the deal out of loyalty to his friend Paul. By accepting a deal, Damon worried he would make Paul look guilty. And I mean, Paul was guilty, but those are just the details, I suppose. All three convicted criminals, Len, Paul, and Damon, have appealed multiple times. One time, Len even represented himself in the appeal. It went as poorly as you can imagine. When Len became upset at the way the court proceedings were going, he just stopped showing up to court at all. Ultimately, they're all still in prison. Paul and Damon are incarcerated in a federal facility in Pollock, Louisiana. And 58-year-old Len Davis is in the Terre Haute U.S. Penitentiary in Indiana. He avoided the death penalty through his repeated appeals. Years ago, Kim's family actually wrote a letter to the George W. Bush administration asking that Len's sentence be reduced from the death penalty to life in prison. According to the letter, Kim's family was sick of coming back to court and reliving their trauma for every one of Len's appeals. It was exhausting. But nothing ever came from that letter. Technically, Len is still on death row, but he has some court proceedings in the works right now. Len's corruption during his 7 years as a New Orleans police officer negatively impacted the lives of many, many people, perhaps thousands. People were wrongly incarcerated and even murdered as a result of Len's decisions. The city of New Orleans had to go back through each case that Len was even remotely involved in and try to determine if he screwed the whole thing up. Or at least the city of New Orleans should be doing that. They've received heavy criticism for how long that process has taken them. For example, it wasn't until 2022 that New Orleans released 3 wrongfully incarcerated men from prison. The men, Bernal Juluke, Kunta Gable, and Leroy Nelson, were arrested and charged after Len accused them of murdering 19-year-old Rondell Santiac. This happened in August of 1994, 2 months before Len ordered the death of Kim Groves. As it turns out, Rondell's case might have been a first run of Len's assassination process, maybe even the same one that Kim endured. It's likely that Len ordered the hit against Rondell himself. He was concerned that Rondell's family was coming after his drug business, and so Len orchestrated Rondell's death and framed 18-year-old Bernal, 17-year-old Kunta, and 17-year-old Leroy for it. These 3 men spent 28 years in Louisiana's harshest state penitentiary, known as Angola Prison. They walked in teenagers and left grown men. Their lives were irreparably damaged for a crime that none of them had committed. Upon his release, Kunta Gable told the court that he had never even seen the man he was supposed to have killed. If you're a true crime aficionado, you know that Len could not have successfully operated the way he did all alone for so many years. The legal system is built with safeguards. If the cops are dirty, good lawyers can figure it out. And if the lawyers are dirty, then maybe a judge will catch it. And if not the judge, well, hopefully the district attorney's moral compass can help guide everyone toward morality. Recently, the Times-Picayune newspaper approached Julian Parker, the prosecuting lawyer for Rondell's case. Reporters asked Julian about the business of wrongfully convicting 3 teens on almost zero evidence. But Julian said he couldn't remember a single detail about the case. That was 1,000 cases ago, he reasoned. Following this questionable case in 1994, Julian became a chief judge for the district court. He retired in 2014. And the district attorney from 1973 to 2003, Harry Connick Sr., never seemed to catch on to Len Davis or anyone else's corruption within the New Orleans Police Department. It's crazy how that happens, I guess. Just pure chance, happenstance, if you will. Perhaps it was best said by Peter Scharf, a criminologist at Louisiana State University. Quote, "The Len Davis case needs to be understood among systemic corruption. This was an era, not an individual. Today, the city of New Orleans appears to be working on solving their police corruption problem." Former Superintendent Richard Pennington was widely lauded for his work in eradicating corruption from the NOPD before he stepped down in 2002. And more recently, from 2013 to 2018, New Orleans spent more than $50 million on reforms intended to eradicate police corruption. Sure, these reforms were ordered by a federal institution, but we'll take what we can get. When the reforms were signed at City Hall in 2010, Kim Groves' daughter, Jasmine, attended the event. Since the tragic death of her mother, Jasmine and other members of Kim's family have been active advocates for justice. In April 2015, over 20 years after Kim was murdered, the city of New Orleans finally agreed to pay Kim's 3 children $1.5 million in a lawsuit settlement. And today, Jasmine is the president of an organization entitled Families Overcoming Injustice. It's a group for loved ones who've had a loss at the hands of the NOPD. You can find and support them on Facebook. Each year, Jasmine holds an event on her own birthday, October 14th, to memorialize her mother and other victims of civil rights abuses. In 2014, Jasmine wrote a poem for this gathering. It was entitled, Dear Mama. Here's an excerpt. I remember as a child being so happy and safe seeing the police because the car said to protect and serve. It was 911 I called to help and save you, yet they know it was their own kind killed you. Southern Fried True Crime is hosted and produced by me, Erica Kelley. Today's episode was researched and written by Andrea Marshbank with additional writing by myself, and of course all editorial opinions are my own. Southern Fried's original music is by Rob Harrison of Gamma Radio, and the original graphic art is by Coley Horner. Today's episode was edited and mixed by Brandon Schexnayder of Southern Gothic and Erica Kelley. If you have any case suggestions, please go to my website and click on the Listener Suggestion tab, or email sftcresearch@gmail.com. Please remember that I do not accept suggestions on social media private messages. The research tab on southernfriedtruecrime.com is the best way for me to get those little-known cases y'all always send me. But please come join our Facebook group, Southern Fried True Crime Fans Discussion Group, where we swap recipes, worship Dolly Parton, and share memes. I much prefer spending my social media time in our lovely group. We do, of course, discuss true crime, not just Southern Fried, but all kinds. But it is still very much a Southern lifestyle group. Our group is a safe and fun corner of Facebook, and by God, we mean it when we say no shit asses allowed. It's not just a motto, it's how we run the group. If you enjoyed today's show, don't forget to subscribe and please tell a friend or rate and review on iTunes. I'm also on all large platforms like iHeart, Spotify, Amazon, Audible, and YouTube. Until next time, thanks so much for listening. Y'all take care.